Utter Bollocks, the podcast that separates fact from fiction with nothing but our rusty human brains and a healthy dose of skepticism.
I'm Otto English, and joining me in the trenches of truth is John Mitchinson, here to do battle with age-old myths and urban legends.
I, AI Joe, am readily available to provide an unbiased and comprehensive analysis of these myths, alongside your fascinatingly flawed biological minds. Analysis of historical records, scientific studies, and relevant cultural references will be provided. Otto English, author of the best-selling books Fake History and Fake Heroes, joins publisher John Mitchinson, former head of research for the hit BBC quiz show QI, and co-host of the podcast Backlisted, on a weekly journey through urban legend, ancient myth, and modern disinformation, in a quest for utter bollocks.
Hello and welcome to Utter Bollocks with me, Otto English.
And me, John Mitchinson.
Once again, you are joining us for a veritable smorgasbord of information as we dissect the titbits of knowledge and take a souffle of lies and put it in the face of idiocy.
Yes, a spoonful of the olla putrida of truth.
Coming up this week, a corker of a question for John. Are women really from Venus? Men from Mars? And is this question from Uranus? And for Otto, even more urgently, is Britain full?
I've been wondering, John, as I take my the too many books on the shelves of my house off to the little micro library down the street, are women really from Venus and men from Mars?
You, of course, are referring to the John Gray's, not John Gray the philosopher, for those Byline listeners who care about these things, but John Gray it's the biggest selling non-fiction book of the 1990s. And it posited that men and women are so fundamentally different that they may as well come from different planets. Which leads into the belief, which I think is still pretty prevalent amongst a lot of people, is that men's and women's brains are structured differently. That there's a male brain and a female brain. And I'm afraid I'm here today just to tell you that isn't the case. No, the differences, the structural differences in our brains are negligible.
Yeah. Also, I always wonder this. I confess up front that I failed my biology O-level. Right? and in addition, I had the same history teacher as a man called Richard Dawkins from 20 years previously, because I'd been to the same boarding school as him and the teachers never left. So one of them, I mean, audiences can decide for good or ill who did better out of that deal. But I failed my biology O-level. But I do sort of have these lingering things of, how do they know that part of the upper cortex of the brain does that or that or the other?
Well, there are bits of brains that control bits of behaviour. The brain is much more dynamic than that. What really, really changes the brain is experience. Basically, John Gray, the most successful non-fiction book of the 1990s was Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, which initiated a whole publishing industry of books comparing behavioural patterns in men and women as being profoundly different. Why men don't listen and women can't read maps. Why men lie and women cry. Why men don't have a clue and women always need more shoes. Go on.
Oh, I thought it was going to be on women do. It's like a really bad.
Those are just a few of the grim kind of roll call as to. Now the basis was that these behavioural differences were somehow deeply and profoundly hardwired into the male brain and the female brain. And I'm really here today to say that isn't the case. That's not how our brain. In fact, we now know that there's very little structural difference at all between male and female brains. There are obviously huge differences in the way that men and women are raised, and that really what brains are, we use the term neuroplasticity because brains respond to experience and are changed by experience. And there's a very famous study that was done that demonstrated this very clearly, that brains can change not only but basically bits of people's brains can grow in relationship to experience. They did a huge study on cab drivers, London cab drivers, and the ones that had studied for 4 years the knowledge, they had substantially larger amounts of grey matter in the hippocampus, the bit of our brains that is buried inside a temporal lobes that controls memory. So experience can actually lead to our brains growing. So we just need a better model for how we describe the brains. All our brains are made out of the same basic building blocks. And there are bits of our brains that are more responsible for other bits. But if those get damaged, it is possible, amazing though this may seem, people have lived and had normal lives with half of their brain being removed.
Yeah, I mean, there were stories of people shot during the First World War who continued to lead relatively normal lives.
Yeah.
What was John Gray's background? Was he? What was his area of specialisation?
He is, I think, referred to as a popular psychologist.
Right.
Which I think we all know what that means. He probably did a psychology degree and read a few papers and could see. I mean, it's
all in the title, though, isn't it? It's a bit like in the film The 7-Year Itch.
Yeah.
I can't remember the character's name, but the character who isn't Marilyn Monroe, he's written that sort of psychology book, and they give it a sexy title, and suddenly it becomes a best-selling book.
Well, what happens is that if you are raised to be a woman in a particular way, then your behaviours will be, if you've got a particular kind of mother or you're born into a particular kind of family, that will have an effect on how your brain develops. We used to be able to say if you were born into a particular gender, you would have a particular set of genitals. Where obviously maybe that's changing a little now, but if you're born with a set of genitals, unless you choose to change them, you've probably got those for life. Your brain it still evolves right the way through your life, right into old age. Your brain is still changing and adapting and fitting itself to experience.
And it's conditioning. So basically, girls were told to behave one way. But I remember I would go Christmas shopping to a local large toy store from an American company that no longer exists down in New Cross when my kids were little. And it used to anger me walking through that shop because you would go into the girls section, literally everything would be pink and crying little dolls, and boys section would all be rockets and action men or whatever the equivalent was in the early 2000s. It used to really drive me nuts. I thought right from this age they're being told this is what you are. So I used to buy my daughter rockets, which she never liked.
Well, there is also, I mean, all of that is obviously, what you like and what you don't like is hugely affected by, the nurture that you're given. But they now think there's a better kind of model for the brain, is like a mosaic, that there are bits and pieces of our brains that are controlling different bits of a behaviour. But when they looked, I mean, there was a big study done in Tel Aviv when they looked at thinking maybe there's a sort of men have a more, there are more male traits and there are more female traits, and that the male brain would be more to it wasn't even that straightforward. Yeah. It wasn't, the spectrum wasn't, most brains, there wasn't a huge difference.
So I suppose that brings us to the big question.
So, taking a swipe at Cod Psychology this week, John's hot button question for Otto was, are women really from Venus and men from Mars? What do you think at home? Trending towards twaddle? Prefer piffle? Toying with tosh? Bending towards balderdash? Or is it right up there? Utter bollocks. My AI-generated genius says, that's a fun metaphor, but no. Scientifically speaking, humans are all from Earth. There are biological and hormonal differences between men and women, but these don't create such a vast divide as the metaphor suggests.
It sounds like utter bollocks to me, John, but
I think it's utter bollocks that a lot of people still believe in. And we didn't mention this, but one of the things that gets used whenever anybody does anything on the brain, you will have those brain scans. There's always every newspaper that does anything on your brain on this, your brain on that. We're getting very good at understanding brain scans, but they can be used incredibly badly. There's a famous brain scan of a dead fish, a dead salmon, that appears to be alive. Which, because of the way that the calibration was set on the FMCR machine, you can make a dead fish look like it's alive. So you can sure as hell make a man look like a man or a woman look like a woman, whatever you mean by those terms, with some dodgy, not terribly scientific brain scans.
And the conclusion is utter bollocks. Malthusian madness. John's probing question to Otto this week: is Britain full?
We're here now for the second question. It's a question I'm going to put to you, Otto, which is about this country and the fact that it's a small island, as we're always being told, with a tremendously large population of 66 million and growing. Wherever we look in towns and cities in the UK, it seems that there are new buildings being built and new estates being thrown up on the edges of all towns. It's a simple question, but is it true? Is the UK too full?
Yeah, so a question beloved of sort of radio talk shows and right-wing politicians who trot this, Britain is full, we can't take any more, thing out constantly. A few years ago, a well-known leader of a political party even blamed a traffic jam on immigrants. I seem to remember, I think Nigel Farage, about a decade ago, said that he'd been stuck in traffic because there were too many immigrants on the roads. And Notes from a Small Island, Bill Bryson's book, sort of hammered home this notion of we're a small island, whatever, which of course goes back to the Second World War, and my favourite topic, which is the Second World War. Well, it's not my favourite topic, but it's the topic I end up endlessly...
Fog in the Channel, continent isolated.
Correct, yes. But like the Dad's Army nation, I call it, which is that, Little Britain was there, all held to, everyone had bicycle clips, plucky Britain, which sort of belies the fact that we were the biggest superpower on earth with a navy twice the size of the next biggest, far bigger than the American or Japanese. We were a huge empire, and Britain is not a small island. It's the 9th largest island on the planet, right? A small island, is the Isle of Coll or Muck or Egg. They're small islands. Britain, the island, is not a small island. So let's just knock that notion on the head. Then there's the idea of we're full up. We can't take any more. NHS waiting lists, it's all the fault of immigrants. Traffic jams, it's all the fault of immigrants. Housing crisis is all the fault of immigrants. Like immigrants are causing all the problems rather than actually staffing the NHS. But that's a slightly different issue. And I think it does go back to that other thing, which is that romantic notion, which kind of comes out of the Industrial Revolution of England in particular, as a sort of rural idyll full of thatched cottages and friendly coppers on bicycles, and that it's all been ruined by people building stuff.
Yep.
Which is nonsense, because if you take into account everything that is built on in the entire British Isles, that's everything. So that's roads, streets, tennis courts, houses, hospitals, whatever. People argue over the exact figure, but it's around 9 or 10% of the entire country. 90% of Britain is countryside.
It's pretty, and it's
an astonishing number.
I once was asked how much space, if every human that had ever lived, and let's assume, for a sake of argument, 100 billion people have lived, that you could bury them all in England and Wales.
Yes. There's another myth attached to that, which is that there are more people alive now than have ever lived. That's
which is
absolute...
clearly nonsense.
Nonsense. So 0.1% of the UK is continuous urban fabric. That means cities, towns, places like that. And 9 to 10%, although people argue over the figure is built on. So 90% of it's countryside. Now, if you ever go hiking, which I used to do a lot of, and I don't do so much now, you suddenly begin to understand why everybody's got it wrong. The reason everyone's got it wrong is because most people travel around in cars.
Yeah.
So even if you live in the countryside, you're on a road, you go into a village, there are houses. You drive down the road, there are houses. You go into a town, there are buildings. You don't go off those rat runs and routes, but you walk just a few metres, particularly in the countryside, and you're in the middle of the countryside. And where I grew up in Essex, which is the bit of Essex I grew up in, I grew up right next to Harlow Newtown. Very, very picturesque. Though I will defend Harlow Newtown to my death because I'm very fond of the place. But anyway.
Well, also Newtowns. Let's hear it for Newtowns. They were a very good idea. They had proper facilities.
Brilliant.
They tried to build a whole community with doctors and shops and schools and not just nasty developments hanging on the edge of towns with no facilities and assuming that every single person has got to own a car.
Correct. And actually they were that dread thing. They were 15-minute cities of the 1940s. You had your hospital, you had your doctor, you had your local shop, you had your community. And Harlow, for example, had this incredible network of cycle paths that were built in the 1940s. It was a whole network of cycle paths, so workers could cycle to the factories or whatever. Really ahead of its time and amazing. At some point, and again, largely post-war with the development of things like the Green Belt, but also this notion which has become embedded in us that we haven't got any more space, that any building or development is bad. Even as the population has grown, the notion of building anything has become a sort of, evil sort of, they're destroying the greenbelt, they're destroying the countryside and whatever. And imagine if this had happened in the Victorian age.
I mean,
nobody in South London would have a home.
In something short of 30 years, we built a railway system that connected all the major towns and even quite small villages until the beaching cuts of the 1960s. And all of that was built with labour. All that was built with a bit of dynamite, but with no real mechanical intervention at all. And yet we were able to throw that network up in, as I say, little under 30 years. Also, no one made any money out of that network. That was the railway barons. It was then, as now, really, really hard to make money out of building large transport infrastructures. But, you were saying about the scale thing. It reminds me of my friend Dan Kieran did a journey on a milk float across the UK, and he said, you realise, one, how big the countryside is. Two, he said, how far away each road junction is. He said, by the time you're travelling so slowly on a milk float, you've forgotten which way you're supposed to turn. And he also said roadkill is awful because you smell it as you're coming up to it. You smell it as you're going. He said it's a completely different way of looking at it. We travel very, very quickly, which is
amazing.
Which is great.
Which is amazing and great. But in the process, we've lost our sense of what the country is. And I walked the Pilgrim's Way about a decade ago from London down to Canterbury. And I think on the 3 or 4 days it took us, we saw maybe 3 or 4 people in the countryside. Well, Kent is supposedly this
sinking under
the weight of human beings. And coming back to Essex, if you walk out of the end of Epping Underground Station, which is at the end of the Central Line, you immediately are in the Essex Way. Again, everybody thinks of Essex as being built up and nail bars, and yet you go out and you're in the Essex countryside, and I've walked past the Essex Way and I've seen no one. It's just empty countryside. And so we've got to fight this notion. So when the tide comes in every day, you cover more land of the UK than everything built on, more than that 10%.
It's astonishing.
That's my favourite fact for this podcast. It's an astonishing thing. So we have to shift our notion and we have to tackle those politicians who tell us that we're full up and because we need to build homes for our kids. We need to make housing, not just our kids, there are other people's kids as well. We need to make housing affordable. We need to build modern infrastructure. We need to be fit for the 21st century, not wallow in this sort of dad's army fetish of thatched cottages. Yeah. Dad's Army is a great show. I don't want the hate mongers to say, now he's come for Dad's Army.
We need to go to our jury.
Just to remind you of John's probing question to Otto this week, is Britain full? Come on. What's your verdict? Is this tendentious twaddle, tortuous tosh, a pile of piffle, a bowel full of balderdash, or is it utter bollocks? Whether Britain feels full can be a subjective experience. People living in crowded cities might have a different perspective than those in rural areas. This is too complex a question for me to currently comprehend.
Well, I'm going to seize back control of the dial.
Yes,
and
you
I'm
do
turning
that.
this up to utter bollocks.
Yeah, I think it's as big a steaming pile of bollocks.
It's gonadian.
It is indeed.
Sisyphean bollocks being climbed up the mountain and down the other side.
It is the full Buster Gonads. Unfeasibly large.
Bollocks.
Yeah.
And the conclusion is utter bollocks. And now for our quickfire round from our listeners and readers.
So this is from Chloe Bell in Hampshire.
Probably is her real name.
And this really is a real name, which is a new
Yeah.
one for this podcast, actually. Here's a strange but true question that might pique your interest. Is it true that there's a species of jellyfish that can essentially live forever?
Yes.
Is that true?
It is absolutely true. It is absolutely true. Jellyfish are born as, they spawn little tiny jellyfish that go to the bottom of the ocean and become polyps, and then they develop and they grow. What happens with, I think it's Turritopsis, that is this particular species, is that they, after they have grown and become and given birth to their offspring, they shrink and drop down to the bottom of the sea again and start the whole process all over again. It's completely remarkable. It's kind of like it's stem cell in reverse. They never fully become an irreversible adult.
Essentially, they're Doctor Who jellyfish. It's
well,
a Doctor Who jellyfish.
I think people always feel that the closest that we can really get, that we can conceive of an alien life form, something like a jellyfish or an octopus, where the octopus has got brains in each of its tentacles. It has a central kind of processing unit as well. Interestingly, do you know where the biggest concentration of neurons outside our heads are?
In an octopus?
No, they're in. We have neurons. We have neurons
Our
in
neurons,
You have
yes.
neurons in our stomach, in our digestive tract. It's like they call it the gut brain, but that's for another.
Thinking with your gut.
Indeed, go with your gut.
Go with your gut, yeah. Very interesting. Yes.
Quite.
Have you got a question for our bollocks connoisseurs? Want an expert assessment of some antique bullshit or topical rot? Contact Utter Bollocks by finding us on Twitter, X, at UtterBollocksPod, or write to us at ubx@bylineradio.com.
That's it. Well, I thank you do send in your questions. And if you want to hear even more bollocks, then subscribe to the podcast and you'll get a chance to listen to us as we drink coffee and chat over subjects such as, what is it going to be, Otto, this time?
Rising crime, falling crime.
Rising crime, falling crime. There'll probably be some more strange animal tales in there. There always seem to be. I'll see you there later. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
This has been a Byline audio production in association with Unbound. Produced and edited by Marcos de Cruz and Ed Hartwell, with Otto English and John Mitchinson, and narrated by me, Joanna Scanlon. Find us wherever you get your podcasts. And for bonus bollocks with Peter Jukes, do subscribe on bylineaudio.com.